In the Forest Ahead. Written by AromaticCedar. Shrieky doth the howling wind, when winter time soon shall begin. The rider seeks another man, before he might vanish again. That's what first caught my eye about the manila envelope. Poetry wasn't exactly commonplace in my profession. Allow me to explain. I work in the archival department of a large Northeastern university's library system. Basically, our job is to sort through all the university's resources left over from the pre-digital era. While that might sound half interesting at first, I assure you, it consists of mulling over acres of mind-numbing survey data and obsolete records. Boredom is the centerpiece of this field. However, from time to time, I do stumble across something interesting. On this particular day, we were going through the psychology school's basement files and determining what needed to be digitally cataloged and what needed to be scrapped. Most of it was what you'd expect. Thousands of patient sign-in forms, insurance and legal paperwork, prescription documentation, referrals, so on and so forth. It was nestled in amongst some long-gone doctor's files. The poem was written neatly in cursive on the outside of the manila folder, and upon opening the file, an avalanche of typed notes fell out. Not just the notes either, but pictures, maps, letters, and newspaper clippings. It was apparent that whatever this story was, some doctor had taken great interest in it. It wasn't until I took the folder home that I started putting together the story, and it's a wild one. Below is what I've pieced together from the doctor's patients' interviews, journal entries, and personal musings. I still wonder what on earth really happened all those years ago. October 1913. Captain Ainsley had a decidedly tame motive for accepting his cousin's invitation. The trees in town were vibrant with that late autumn splendor, and they brought upon a certain joyousness in the young captain. The opportunity to explore the hues residing outside of Tarrytown excited him. The fall can have a way of captivating some, as if the looming dread of winter grants every shade of red and orange a little more vibrance. Captain Ainsley was a man never acquainted with the sport of bird hunting. In fact, this was his first excursion into the countryside for quite some time. A man of town since boyhood, he wasn't a woodsman by any stretch of the imagination. Urban traits aside, his stint in the service had granted him enough comfort around munitions and campsites to evaporate any hesitation he might have harbored in saying yes. His cousin's guidance permitting, he found it proper to try his hand at bringing home a few quail. Ainsley's younger cousin Jasper, who masterminded the idea of a late October hunting trip, was to serve as guide for the duo. Jasper had more experience with nature than his older friend, and though his former days of wooden exploration didn't include the woods north of town, he assumed all the forests of old New York had an inviting way about them. Jasper had recently moved to Tarrytown to fill a machinist job, and found his new proximity to Ainsley the perfect excuse to procure a hunting partner. As a more seasoned member of the town's community, the captain had little trouble in finding a friend willing to help aid in their departure. Mr. Morris owned a dry goods store in town, and had enjoyed the captain's company for a late evening cigar. One of the few men in town who owned a reliable truck, he offered kindly to drive the hunters north of town. As the duo hauled the last of their bags into the bed, they clambered into Mr. Morris's delivery truck. Tarrytown began to slowly shrink in the distance as they began to roll onward.
You two better triple check you've got the gear you need for a few nights in the forest. Last thing we need in town is another missing machinist,
Mr. Morris bellowed, his demand a mixture of jest and concern.
Have faith in me, dear Mr. Morris. This isn't my first bird hunt. Not to mention, I assume my dear cousin the captain here has faced far more challenging things than this, given his prior occupation.
Jasper tapped his cap with a wink to the driver. The man gave them a nod and pulled the clutch on his delivery truck.
Happy hunting, gentlemen, and good luck. I'll be here Monday before lunchtime to pick you sorry boys up again. I'm eager to see those bags of yours filled to the brim with bird.
Hey, just make sure there's room in that trunk of yours. Expect nothing less than a half-ton of quail. With that, the cousins waved their neighbor farewell. Mr. Morris began to rumble down the long road back to Tarrytown, delighted by his voluntary role in the cousins' adventure. Their gear spread across the rustic country road. An autumn breeze both invited and warned the men of the wholesome isolation they now inhabited together. Things feel different in late October, and both hunters took a moment to absorb the chilling, beautiful aura of the wooded hollow. The men began organizing their supplies and hauling it onto their shoulders. Say, Jasper, did Morris say something about a missing machinist back in town? Jasper didn't look up from juggling the bags of camping gear onto his back, but surrendered a half smile.
Yeah, some fella who had been working there a few years just up and vanished sometime last fall. They say he was somewhere up this way visiting family, and just never came back to town. My guess is he just decided wherever he ended up was nicer than that old shop.
Well, I was wondering how a business could be so desperate as to give you, of all people, a job. I should have figured, the captain jabbed.
You better watch it, or I'll take your job too.
With that, the hunters started into the towering behemoth of wilderness. There was a narrow path that opened along the road, like the maw of an earthen giant. Something was subtly overwhelming about it, as if the place had long been shared amongst more worlds than their own. The day's end crept up on them, and setting up camp became a quick priority. By nightfall, the tents were pitched, and a decent fire was beginning to take root at their feet. The duo, tired from a day of hauling gear and trudging through the bush, broke out a couple of small cigars. Over a meal of beans and bread, the two discussed life and work. Jasper prodded about the captain's time in the army, and as was his nature, Ainsley revealed little. They entertained talk of their families and discussed where life might take them in the coming years. As night progressed, the wind adopted an unpleasant bite to it, as if upset by their prolonged conversation. Influenced by their cold, quiet setting, the men began to converse about their temporary home.
It's remarkable out here, isn't it? I mean, I know you've been all over the world, but what a wonderful time to be outdoors,
commented Jasper, blowing blue smoke from the side of his mouth.
No doubt. I certainly see the draw nature has on many.
He paused and looked over his shoulder out into the darkened field beside them. Personally, I find it quite enjoyable during daylight. Perhaps my city-dwelling mind hasn't yet adapted to its nighttime charm.
Ha! Is my old cousin the captain a bit spooked? I must say, I did expect it a little. I saw it on your face when Mr. Morris was driving back to town. That's alright, dear cousin. I can't blame you. I've spent many an autumn night camping under the stars, but even I feel on edge. Just a bit. I guess one can't blame us given the history of this old hollow tree, right?
The captain smiled at his cousin. Spooked? No, I'm afraid you're mistaken, dear sir. I'm just a bit frayed after hearing your mouth run all afternoon. Also, I didn't even know this area had a name, let alone a history." The captain queried, curious as to how his newcomer cousin seemed more familiar with the area than himself, despite his residency of almost 10 years. Jasper looked up at the question with a face of excited disbelief. Perhaps he, too, was caught off guard by having some knowledge of the Hollow that his partner did not.
"You must be joking. You've never once been told the legend of Sleepy Hollow?"
Of all his years residing in the quiet nook of Tarrytown, New York, not a soul had shared with the dear captain its ghastly folklorist gem. In some forgotten time, the tale had been known all over the United States, but had since fallen into obscurity amongst the unpleasant and unnerving. The story is a decidedly morbid one. As it's told, there was a small community north of Tarrytown that consisted of a few small farms. A peculiar, melancholy atmosphere had inhabited the region long before the Europeans arrived, and once they did, the name Sleepy Hollow was fit to stay. During the Revolutionary War, the Battle of White Plains was fought amidst the hills of Sleepy Hollow. Among the English forces fought a group of hired Hessian mercenaries. The Hessians were a group of German madmen, as the New Yorkers called them, hired from the depths of the Black Forest to fight on England's behalf. They brought with them an old worldly brutality that astonished many of their American adversaries, and even their own British commanders. A group of these soldiers were members of a cavalry squadron and came to meet a terribly violent fate upon riding into the fight. An American artillery unit had entrance atop some nameless hill, prepared to bombard the approaching ranks. A particularly nasty and ambitious mercenary was leading the charge when the cannons opened fire. The first shot flew forward, bouncing off the earth and upwards towards the approaching riders. The cannonball collided with the Hessian's upper half. The soldiers watching nearby said his body didn't flinch as his head vanished into oblivion. Then followed a most horrific display, as the unnamed cavalryman's corpse stayed erect and alert on his saddle, never swaying or breaking posture. Hauntingly, the headless rider's horse began to gallivant across the field, breaking the soldiers' lines as he galloped. The Hessian stayed eerily stoic and erect as the spook stallion rode his spectral passenger into the darkest opening the surrounding forest presented them. Though no soul could have possibly still inhabited the man, those present that day swore until death they saw the headless horseman crop his horse one last time before vanishing into the darkened hollow. The horseman was said to have terrorized Sleepy Hollow for years following the battle. Sleep-thieving stories of frightful encounters with the soldier began the very night of his death. A farm boy returning from a neighbor's was said to have been chased down by the specter, until he was able to make it past the Tarrytown Bridge. Since that night, tales of the horseman's malevolent chases didn't cease. Children would say he procured a pumpkin to carry with him, a replacement for his missing head. They talked of terrifying cackle that would echo through the forest late in the fall, and the sound of racing horses. No one knows where or why the horseman stayed, or which parts of the story are true. All that's known now is the town exists no more, swallowed up in the passage of time, abandoned by those unwilling to remain amongst the hollow's long shadows. God, I've never heard such a story in my life. They had a bizarre imagination back in those days. So dark. A knack for grim things. Far more than I. The captain stated, stunned and unnerved by the proximity to the story.
Perhaps. I personally find the tale amusing. A good story to alert the senses and keep one's eyes sharp. Just the thing we need to enact a successful hunt tomorrow.
Yes, given of course I don't sleep to that ghastly rider. I suppose a startling tale does make a cool night all the more enjoyable. They laughed with one another, and commenced once more to talk about trivial things. Such heavy, ominous stories had no place in the mind of a man preparing for sleep, and Jasper found himself trying desperately to remove the story from his own mind. Truth be told, the tale wasn't real to him before their trip. Now though, his own mind began to wonder what creatures might inhabit the woods around them. The fire now held only a deep red hue as the cousins slept soundly within their respective tents. Tired from the day, and comforted by the presence of their guns, the men hadn't much trouble drifting away to happier places. It had been hours since the last words were spoken, and a steady wind tasseled the limbs above their camp. It whistled in a low, rhythmic way, like the crisp, labored breath of some corporal spirit. The moon was bright, though not full. Half of it was absorbed by the darkness of the sky, and dark it felt indeed. Ainsley awoke chilled and partially dazed some hour later into the night. He groggily judged that if he wished to fall back asleep, he'd have to go relieve himself outside first. Unbuttoning the tent, the young captain was surprised by the chill in the air. Even through his wool coat, the damp coldness of night warned him to return to his tent. He plodded along to the edge of the field and began to enact the business he'd contracted with himself to do. Looking up at the half moon on its darkened stage, his eyes began to fall to the horizon. A sliver of slightly darker night marked where the field ended and the sky began. Upon it, he noted what had drawn his eyes. Some odd structure in the middle of the field. He squinted at the thing and stared ever longer at it. It had a dark, slender base, maybe 5 or 6 feet tall. Perhaps not black, but close to it. Atop, this looked to sit an even slimmer fixture, perhaps 4 feet above the base. There was something familiar about the thing, though the captain was unable to recall to memory what it was. Then it moved. Not much, only a foot or so to the right. The captain saw all 4 of its legs, and how they had stepped to one side. He now saw the glimmer of a tail sway back and forth amidst the tall grass. Atop the night-born creature sat what might only be described as a silhouette, a resemblance of something so familiar, yet missing a piece of its humanity. A head. They stood there out in the field, one on top of the other, not trotting or whinnying, no movement from atop the beast, only stoic, observant silence. It was as if they had been standing out there the entire night. Ainsley's eyes opened to a tent filled with the warm light of morning. His exposed face was cold, but the rest of him remained in the calming warmth beneath his blanket. He could hear his cousin outside, the fire awoken from its rest as well. As the young captain passed the threshold of his tent, memories of the eerie night prior re-emerged from memory. How on earth had he managed to get back into his tent and fall asleep? He had seen the horsemen! What had happened? How long had he looked? And where did the thing go? The man's mind began to calm as the possibility of a very vivid, unpleasant dream entered his head. He struggled within to remember those hazy hours, though the dream suggestion eased his mind. Certainly, such a ludicrous thing couldn't have taken place. The crisp brightness of morning seemed to evaporate some of the forest's mystique away. For one, the field to their left didn't seem as large as it had under the darkened sky. The trees no longer loomed above them, instead, quietly boasting their fiery palette of colorful leaves. The man took all the time between breakfast and noon to stalk the field for quail. At first, Jasper tasked his partner with skipping a stone into some thatch work of briars and grass, and as a bird or two would scurry upward, he pierced the air with one loud crack. Retrieving the birds was harder without dogs, but the brambles didn't pose as large an obstacle with such heavy clothing on. Soon the men were taking turns spotting and firing with one another, until each had perfected a singular routine of tossing their own stone and raising their guns accordingly. The captain decided he enjoyed the sport. There was a sweet marriage of nature and elegance to it. His internal brush with the horse-bound specter was further from his mind than almost anything. They continued on like this until their hard work demanded payment, and they started back for a camp to prepare lunch. On their way, they counted their birds. Jasper had come out 3 birds ahead of his companion, though he hesitated to brag, as unlike himself, the captain had managed to down every bird he fired at. Not a single shot missed. As the residual odor of burning oak wafted over from their former fireplace, an odd sensation overtook the men. Approaching their camp, they stood in confusion at its utter messiness and disarray. Both tents were all but collapsed, and the captain's had a tear down the side, the length of his entire body. The fire's dead embers lay scattered across the floor of the forest, as if some mighty wind had blown the ashes outward. The ground was riddled with muddy divots and holes, and both of their makeshift seats sat toppled over.
Good Lord,
"What the hell happened here?" croaked the older through disturbed breaths. The eeriness of the woods began to seep back into their minds.
I haven't the faintest clue. Maybe a group of whitetail came bounding through here. I've heard those things get all riled up in late fall. You know, with it being mating season and all.
Still, the men stood in disbelief at the state of their surroundings, and Ainsley inspected his damaged abode. The smell of burning gunpowder radiated throughout the area, and though both men had spent the morning firing shell after shell, this aroma felt older and more primitive than their own. After resetting their tents and making whatever amends they could to the tear, a simple lunch was enjoyed by the cousins. They talked very little whilst eating, internally processing the swaying trees around them. It was getting cloudier now, not in the way a rainy day might, but as those dreary days in winter sometimes do, dull and gray in their coldness. Collecting their thoughts and finishing their meal, the men decided it best to split ways for the afternoon, to cover more hunting ground. The captain was to take the lower field, and Jasper the field opposite across the hill. The two parted ways with words of luck and shouldered their weapons. Within 5 or 10 minutes of crunching atop the dried leaves, Ainsley heard a shotgun blast ring out across the hill. His cousin had no doubt set out to one-up his own bounty, and as such, the captain began walking faster towards the field. As the opening came closer and closer into view, he saw from across the swirling tan grass some movement near the field's far side. Eager to see if perhaps it was a deer he spotted, the hunter crouched low and worked his way slowly along its edge. He caught glimpses of swaying brown grow closer and closer as he approached. No doubt, the outline of a meandering whitetail feeding under the graying sky. As he closed in, the captain began to remark at the size of the creature. It seemed much larger than any deer he knew of, closer to a moose in size and stature. He drew his weapon and began to raise it upward. Clearing the tall grass, he now had a clear view of his former target. No more than 20 feet away stood a dark brown saddled horse. Ainsley drew the bead of his gun back down on the ground. Thankfully, he hadn't let his eagerness take the life of someone's animal. He approached the creature, noticing it was tied to an old dead oak. The wind stung his cheek and he felt his nose getting colder. He walked up to the horse, who stood silent and unreactive to his presence. As he got within just a few yards of it, he spotted someone stooping behind the animal. He stared and watched the man crouch beside it, puzzled by why a rider had ridden himself so far out into the bush. He wore a bright red riding coat, and some blue sash was thrown over his shoulder. Tall black boots and white trousers completed his ducking frame. The captain spoke. "I didn't mean to scare you, friend. I was just about to spook this field for some quail." The stranger didn't flinch or startle. He stayed crouched, facing away, unmoving. Just as more words rose out of the captain's throat, some malevolent feeling stole them from his lips. The stranger stood up slowly, still facing away, though his sight made Ainsley's heart scream for reprieve. The slender figure of a cavalryman stood before him, dressed in a manner not familiar to modern men. Where Ainsley expected to see the back of his head, he saw only the hopeless woods beyond. The thing pivoted around with utter silence, not a thing above the shoulders, nor some trick of the eyes. Standing in the dead evening air was the specter of Sleepy Hollow. It was the most grotesque sight the captain had ever seen. The Hessian's tunic was stained with the black and crimson that had long spilled during his violent departure. Not even his neck remained, just a horrid absence that made Ainsley's very soul shiver with dread. The thing staggered once, as if off balance, taking one uneasy step towards the frozen man. His movements were unnatural, limbs swinging and fingers curling as he stepped. Somehow the thing seemed both unsteady and aggressive in its gait. After a step or two more, the demon began to run at the captain. Adrenaline took the hunter as he stumbled backwards and sprinted feverishly across the field, his lungs burning in the October air. He heard twigs snapping under the feet of his pursuer. Glancing over his shoulder, he could see the thing standing still at the edge of the field, staring as if it was the night before, arms to its side, monstrously stoic, and radiating an unfathomable sense of evil and dread. Further and further he ran into the woods, the sky continuing to dim as his mind raced. His head was both full and absent all at once. The wind howled with laughter at him, his eyes tearing up as he ran. His heart's frantic beat found a partner in rhythm, the steady sound of a horse galloping in the darkened distance. The sky was almost black by now, and the captain was furious at his misdirection. Fearful and exhausted, he didn't see a stump hidden beneath the leaves. Tripping, he plummeted down a wooden decline, hitting saplings and stones as he tumbled. He landed in the muddy remnants of a summer stream, choked out by an autumn dry spell. Ainsley's eyes darted to his right as the aggressive hoofbeats grew louder. In his shock, he had failed to remember that he was holding a weapon. Somewhere in the fall he had lost his bag of cartridges, but his gun was now lying next to him. Loaded with 2 blasts of birdshot, he grabbed the muddy thing and pointed it upwards towards the trail, and prepared to pull the trigger. The beats grew louder and louder as they approached, the horse whinnied with excitement. The sound of skidding leaves and slowing steps confirmed that the being had stopped on the trail above. Aiming his gun high, Ainsley didn't blink, his entire being fixated on the horror that lay beyond his sight. He waited and pointed, tipping over the point of madness as he began to laugh slowly at the unseen horseman. His laughs turned to screaming, a manic display of his breaking mind. The events of the day had taken his very sanity, and perhaps that was enough for the monster. Not a noise came from above. Minutes passed, as the captain's yelling and taunting of the thing made his voice grow hoarse. Soon, it was silent again, and the ragged man lowered his gun. It was as if the demonic thing had vanished off the face of the earth. A few wet maple leaves stuck to the side of Ainsley's face as he awoke once more to the cold. It was light again, a new day, though some transition had been made with November's arrival, and even the air knew it was time for winter. His whole body seemed to ache, and he could hardly move his near-frozen digits. A crow called from somewhere far away. The disheveled captain noticed he had fallen asleep on the side of the road. The same one he'd so foolishly been left upon 2 days prior. Disoriented beyond his own understanding, he threw the gun he'd been cradling over his shoulder. Limping down the road, the dazed captain tried to make sense of everything prior. The circumstances made no sense. They baffled him and made him question his very being. How could such a thing exist in this world? Or any world for that matter? Perhaps it had all been real. Or perhaps some deep-seated flaw in the man's brain had been triggered by his excursion into the woods. After all, he had long heard of soldiers whose minds broke deep within, their mental destruction revealed decades later. As he pontificated his sanity, Ainsley thought of his cousin, probably worried beyond console by the disappearance of his partner. As he made his way along the road, a familiar opening came about ahead of him. The captain fell to his knees in relief that he'd found it. If he remembered correctly, this was where Mr. Morris was to meet them today. Quietly, he waited and hoped for his cousin's return. As he wondered about the damage the cold might be enacting on his tired being, he heard a distant rumble from down the way. His eyes widened as he saw a black Ford rolling its way up the road. It wasn't Mr. Morris' delivery truck. It was the Tarrytown sheriff. Stopping just before reaching the tired man, the sheriff hopped off of his wagon, rifle in hand. He eyed the captain up and down bewildered, before running over to him and grabbing his shoulder.
Good God, we thought we lost both of you.
The captain's hazy eyes looked upon the sheriff with profound confusion, and inquired about what on earth he meant.
Please get in. We need to get you home. I'll explain as much as I can. A couple driving down from Canada was flagged down by your cousin yesterday evening. He kept saying he'd found something and insisted they head into town and call the sheriff. I headed out just before dark, and when I got there, Jasper was all shooked up and carrying on about something. He kept saying, headless, no head, headless, no head, over and over again.
The captain's stomach began to twist and knot. Did he explain what he meant?
Well, eventually we found out. He took us to a spot a few miles into the woods, along the edge of a wheat field. That's where Jasper said he found him, propped up under an old dead oak. Earl Thompson, the machinist that went missing a while back. It was him. Had his wallet and everything. Been there a while too by the looks of it. The poor bastard was missing his whole head. Everything from the chest up. Just plumb gone. All gruesome and messy. Good God, we're still trying to come to gripes with what the hell happened. We were all worried you gone missing and tried to find you. Now here we found you, but...
He trailed off. But what, Sheriff?
Well, your cousin, he kept on talking nonsense, you know? Like he'd seen something. I mean, I can't blame the poor fellow. Finding Earl like that? Anyways, he took off across the field full sprint just before nightfall. My guess is to find you. We've been looking for the two of you all morning. I'm sorry. We'll keep looking. I'm sure we'll find him soon.
Captain Ainsley stared blankly at the approaching town, tormented by his memories of Sleepy Hollow. As his entire reality began to dissolve in front of him, as his sanity said a final and complete farewell. There were but only two things he trusted to be true. The spectral rider of Sleepy Hollow had chased down 2 hunters that night, and only one of them was coming home.